Have you ever paused to consider that your life is not a random walk through fleeting moments, but a divine journey, carefully orchestrated by a God who desires your flourishing, both spiritually and materially? Let me ask you, what if the God who created the heavens and the earth has set aside for you a promise not just of survival, but of abundant, overflowing wealth? What if you are destined by divine decree to be a billionaire, not merely in banknotes, but in blessings, influence, and purpose? The scriptures speak of a God who is no respecter of persons, yet delights in rewarding faithfulness and obedience. Wealth, in this sacred context, is no idle dream or selfish vanity. It is a manifestation of God's grace upon a life aligned with His will. It is written that He who gives seed to the sower and bread for food will multiply your resources in due season. This is not a mere metaphor. It is a promise carved into the very fabric of divine justice. But how does one grasp this promise? It begins in the hidden chambers of faith. The true billionaire is first rich in spirit, rooted in trust, humility, and reverence for the Almighty. The path to such wealth is not paved with shortcuts or worldly schemes. It is forged through a steadfast heart that believes God's timing is perfect and His provisions are sure. It is the soul that dares to hope, to believe that God's blessings are not scarce, but abundant beyond measure. Yet, let us be clear, this promise is not an endorsement of greed. The riches you are destined for are a sacred stewardship entrusted to you for a higher calling. The billionaire called by God is not one who hoards, but one who multiplies, for the kingdom, for justice, for mercy. Imagine the power in your hands when divine wealth meets divine purpose. You become a beacon of hope, a fountain of blessing pouring into the lives of the poor, the broken, the forgotten. You become a living testimony that God's provision is limitless. And yes, the journey will not be without trials. The winds will howl, the storms will rage, and the nights may seem long. But remember, it is through these very challenges that the promise is refined. When you press on in faith despite adversity, you reveal the depth of your trust in God's providence. Every trial is a stepping stone, every hardship a lesson, every setback a divine preparation for the abundance to come. You are not here by accident. You are destined to rise to overcome, to become a vessel through which God's kingdom advances in the world. To be a billionaire is not merely to possess wealth, but to wield it with godly wisdom and purpose, transforming communities, uplifting the needy, and shining the light of God's goodness into every dark corner. So I ask you now, will you receive this promise? Will you open your heart to the divine call that says, you are destined for abundance? You are destined to be a billionaire, not by your own might, but by my Spirit working through you. Walk in faith, act in obedience, and steward well the blessings God places in your hands. The future you desire is not just a dream. It is a promise from the Creator of all things. Let this truth settle deep within you. God's promise of wealth is not only real but personal. Your destiny as a billionaire is sealed by His word, empowered by His Spirit, and fulfilled by your faithful walk. Rise up, beloved, and claim the inheritance that awaits you. The riches of heaven are yours to steward, now and forever. When we speak of wealth in the divine context, we are called to step beyond the limited human understanding of riches as mere accumulation of money or possessions. Wealth, as ordained by God, carries a deeper, more profound significance, one that intertwines with purpose, destiny, and the very design of creation itself. From the moment the universe was formed, it was not only a place of beauty and order, but also a stage set for human beings to fulfill a grander mission. This mission includes stewardship of the earth, nurturing life, and expanding God's kingdom through blessings, both spiritual and material. God's plan for wealth is rooted in His desire for His children to live abundant lives. This abundance is not random or accidental. It is part of the divine blueprint for humanity. Scripture is filled with reminders that God delights in blessing His people, not merely to satisfy fleeting desires, but to empower them for greater work. The promise of wealth is tied to purpose. Those who are entrusted with resources are meant to use them wisely, creatively, and generously to bring about transformation. Wealth, therefore, is a sacred tool, an extension of God's creative power that enables individuals to impact their families, communities, and the world. This divine design challenges the common worldly narrative that wealth is the result of luck, chance, or mere human effort. Instead, it presents a vision where wealth is a calling, an appointment set by God, designed specifically for each individual according to His wisdom. To see wealth this way is to understand that it is part of one's destiny. The blessings we receive are not for selfish indulgence, but for fulfilling the tasks God has placed before us. The resources we are given become the means through which divine purposes are realized. This transforms wealth from a goal into a responsibility, a sacred duty to be fulfilled with integrity and grace. Understanding wealth as part of God's divine plan also calls us to a higher standard of living. We are called to recognize that material blessings come with spiritual weight. The abundance we receive is not only a reflection of God's generosity, but also a reflection of His trust in us. When God promises wealth, He is entrusting us to be faithful stewards, careful not to be distracted by vanity or greed. It is a call to live with wisdom and humility, knowing that the gifts we hold are given to advance His kingdom and glorify His name. The divine design for wealth invites us to view every blessing as a signpost pointing toward a larger destiny. It reminds us that we are part of a story much greater than ourselves, a story where God's provision flows abundantly to those who seek to live in alignment with His will. This design assures us that wealth is not a distant dream but a promised inheritance, available to all who trust in God's providence and walk faithfully in His purpose. Faith is the cornerstone on which all promises of God stand firm, especially the promise of wealth and abundance. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, for faith is the lens through which we perceive His nature, His power, and His unwavering commitment to His children. To grasp the fullness of God's promise of wealth, one must first understand that faith is not merely an abstract belief, but a living, breathing trust in the character of God. It is the confident assurance that what God has spoken will come to pass, regardless of current circumstances or visible evidence. The journey toward divine wealth begins deep within the heart, where faith takes root and grows. It is faith that empowers a believer to see beyond the limitations of poverty, scarcity, and doubt. When the world around us says impossible, faith responds with the quiet yet unshakable voice of, with God, all things are possible. This is the faith that moves mountains and unlocks heavenly blessings. It is a faith that does not waver with the winds of trial or falter in the face of delay. Rather, it endures, presses forward, and claims the promise as certain, even when the path is not yet clear. The Scriptures testify repeatedly that God rewards those who diligently seek Him and place their trust wholly in Him. It is through faith that we align ourselves with God's will and open ourselves to His provision. Faith is the vessel that carries the blessings of heaven into our earthly lives. It is by faith that Abraham was counted righteous and blessed beyond measure, by faith that David rose from shepherd boy to king, and by faith that the early saints overcame adversity to build the foundation of the church. These stories remind us that faith is not passive but active. It demands a living response, a continual leaning on God's promises even when fulfillment seems distant. Faith also anchors us in the truth that wealth, while promised, is ultimately a gift from God, and not something we earn by human effort alone. It is God who gives the increase, who multiplies the seed sown in obedience and stewardship. This understanding removes any pride or self-reliance and replaces it with a posture of humility and dependence on the divine. Those who walk in faith recognize that their identity is found not in riches, but in their relationship with the Creator, and from that relationship flows a supernatural provision that transcends worldly systems. Faith shapes how we receive wealth when it comes. It influences our attitude, our choices, and the way we steward what God entrusts to us. Without faith, wealth can easily become a source of fear, anxiety, or misuse. But with faith, wealth becomes a powerful tool for blessing others, advancing God's kingdom, and living out a purpose far greater than ourselves. Faith transforms wealth from a mere accumulation of assets into a testimony of God's faithfulness and generosity. Thus, faith is the foundation upon which God's promise of wealth rests. It is the key that unlocks the door to divine abundance. Without it, all earthly riches are hollow and fleeting. But with faith, we step confidently into the destiny God has prepared, knowing that as we trust Him, we will see His promises unfold in our lives in miraculous and abundant ways. The promise of wealth from God comes with a profound responsibility, one that separates true blessing from mere accumulation. It is essential to understand that wealth in God's eyes is not an end in itself, but a sacred trust, a stewardship entrusted to us for a higher purpose. The pursuit of riches without this understanding often leads to greed, a destructive force that corrupts the soul and distances us from the divine. True wealth, as promised by God, must be managed with wisdom, humility, and a heart oriented toward service. Stewardship begins with the recognition that everything we have is ultimately God's. The Bible teaches us that the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. We are but caretakers of His possessions. This perspective shifts our mindset from ownership to guardianship. When God entrusts us with wealth, He expects us to use it wisely and generously, reflecting His character through how we handle resources. Wealth is not a reward to hoard, but a tool to build, bless, and expand God's kingdom on earth. The danger of greed is real and powerful. It blinds the heart, creating an insatiable desire for more, which never satisfies. Greed leads to exploitation, selfishness, and moral decay. Many have fallen into ruin because they placed wealth above righteousness, forgetting that true riches lie in a life lived according to God's will. In contrast, stewardship calls for a disciplined and intentional approach to wealth, a commitment to honesty, fairness, and generosity. Wisdom is at the heart of stewardship. It requires discernment to invest, to give, and to plan according to God's guidance rather than worldly pressures. A steward is someone who understands that wealth is a seed sown for multiplication, not just for immediate gratification. The Scriptures commend those who multiply their talents, who care for the poor, and who manage their resources with prudence. Such wisdom ensures that blessings flow not only to ourselves but to those in need, creating a ripple effect of divine favor. Generosity is the hallmark of a true steward. God's promise of wealth is deeply connected to the call to bless others. The rich in God's kingdom are those who open their hands and hearts to the poor, the broken, and the marginalized. They use their abundance to lift burdens, support missions, and invest in the lives of others. This generosity reflects God's own heart, a God who gave His Son so that all might have life and have it abundantly. Stewardship also means accountability. Those who receive great blessings are accountable not only to God, but also to their communities. Wealth entrusted without responsibility can lead to destruction, but wealth managed with care becomes a powerful testimony of faithfulness. It demonstrates that God's promises are not just words, but living realities that shape our actions and influence the world around us. The promise to be wealthy is inseparable from the promise to be faithful. God's blessings are given to those who honor Him with their resources and use them to fulfill His divine purposes. This transforms wealth from a potential snare into a platform for eternal impact. When we embrace stewardship, we align ourselves with God's heart, becoming co-workers in His kingdom, entrusted with the riches of heaven to bring hope and restoration to a needy world. The journey toward the wealth that God promises is never without its challenges. It is a path marked by tests, trials, and moments of uncertainty that serve a divine purpose far greater than mere earthly gain. These obstacles are not signs of God's absence or disfavor. Rather, they are opportunities for growth, refinement, and the strengthening of faith. Divine providence is at work even in the midst of hardship, guiding and sustaining those who trust in God's promises. Trials serve as the crucible in which character is forged. Without struggle, the strength necessary to steward great wealth and responsibility cannot be developed. God's promise of abundance is intertwined with the development of patience, perseverance, and wisdom. The believer is called to endure hardship with a steadfast heart, knowing that every difficulty is a step toward greater blessing. The Scriptures remind us that the testing of faith produces endurance, and endurance leads to maturity. Maturity essential for handling the riches God intends to entrust. Divine providence means that no trial is random or meaningless. Every challenge is under God's sovereign control and is used to perfect His plans in our lives. When we face obstacles on the road to wealth, it is God who orchestrates these circumstances to teach, redirect, and prepare us. His providence ensures that even in apparent setbacks, His purposes move forward. The believer can take comfort in knowing that God is not distant or indifferent. He is intimately involved in every detail, working all things together for good. Faith is tested and proven through trials. The promise of wealth is not fulfilled through effortless gain, but through faithful endurance. Those who claim God's promise must be prepared to face opposition, delays, and hardships. These experiences are not punishments, but refining fires that remove impurities and reveal true dependence on God. The story of every great figure in Scripture who received divine blessings includes seasons of waiting, struggle, and apparent defeat before the ultimate breakthrough. Trials also deepen our reliance on God's provision. When resources are scarce or circumstances difficult, we learn to trust not in our own strength, but in the limitless power of God. This dependence transforms the way we view wealth, not as a self-made achievement, but as a miraculous gift. It cultivates humility and gratitude, anchoring the believer's heart in God rather than in the fleeting security of material things. The promise of wealth, therefore, is inseparable from the promise of divine presence in every season of life. God's providence is a constant companion, guiding the believer through storms with a steady hand. Each trial overcome becomes a testimony to God's faithfulness and an encouragement to others who face similar struggles. It reveals that true wealth is not just the accumulation of possessions, but the rich experience of God's sustaining grace amid adversity. These trials prepare us for the stewardship of greater blessings. They shape our hearts to be wise, compassionate, and resilient, qualities necessary for handling the responsibilities that come with divine wealth. Through every challenge, God's providence assures us that no obstacle is insurmountable when we walk in faith. His promise remains steadfast, and His blessings await those who persevere with trust and obedience. Faith without works is dead, and the promise of God's wealth is not fulfilled through wishful thinking alone. To manifest the divine promise of becoming a billionaire, or truly abundant in any sense, requires deliberate and consistent action aligned with God's will. God's blessings are invitations to partnership, calling us not only to believe but to actively participate in the unfolding of His plans. Manifestation is thus an act of obedience and faithfulness, where belief is translated into purposeful steps toward the destiny God has prepared. The journey of manifestation begins with clarity of vision. God grants revelation to those who seek Him earnestly, revealing not just promises but also the path to fulfillment. This vision is a divine blueprint, a God-given purpose that sets the direction for our efforts. Without vision, the promise remains dormant. With vision, it becomes a guiding star that motivates and directs every decision and action. Manifestation requires that we hold fast to this vision, refusing to be distracted or discouraged by temporary setbacks. Action inspired by faith involves discipline and persistence. It demands a daily commitment to move forward, even when progress seems slow or unseen. God honors those who are faithful in small things and who continue to labor with integrity and excellence. Each step taken in alignment with God's purpose is a seed sown into the fertile ground of His blessings. This persistence is not a stubborn insistence on human will, but a humble submission to God's timing and methods, trusting that He works all things according to His perfect plan. Manifestation also involves cultivating a heart posture that welcomes God's guidance. Prayer, meditation on Scripture, and sensitivity to the Spirit's leading are vital in discerning the next right move. This spiritual attunement ensures that our actions are not driven by selfish ambition or impulsive desires, but are inspired by divine wisdom. When we move in harmony with God's voice, our efforts become infused with supernatural favor, turning ordinary work into extraordinary results. Manifesting God's promise involves embracing opportunities to bless others along the way. God's wealth is never meant to be hoarded but shared. Those who manifest His promise recognize that their success is a platform for generosity, influence, and kingdom impact. This outward flow creates a cycle of blessing where giving unlocks more abundance and opens doors that might otherwise remain closed. Manifestation, therefore, is not just personal prosperity, but a conduit for God's goodness to reach many. God's promise also calls us to act with courage and boldness. Manifesting a destiny as vast as becoming a billionaire requires stepping into the unknown, taking risks that faith makes possible. It demands a rejection of fear and doubt, replacing them with confidence in God's power and provision. This boldness is not recklessness, but a confident trust in God's promises, a willingness to move forward when others hesitate, and a readiness to claim what God has declared ours. Ultimately, manifestation is the divine partnership between God's promise and our willing response. It is an active faith that believes, acts, and perseveres, knowing that God is faithful to bring His word to completion. Through obedient action, we align ourselves with the flow of heaven's blessings, turning God's promise of wealth from a distant hope into a living reality.